Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Today's lecture is number 9 and the title is Translation versus Interpretation or Interpreting. Now we will go through, as usual, the learning objectives, and I'll give you a little introduction. Then we'll talk about the translation domains, and then the translator's tools and aids, and we will be talking about what is meant by interpretation or interpreting, then conference interpreting, then the definition of a conference interpreter, then types and modes of interpreting. Then we will finish off with the difference between the translation and interpreting. So hopefully, by the end of this lecture, you should be able to show knowledge of what is meant by conference interpreting. And you would be able to tell us the difference between translation and interpreting. If you could do that by the end of this lecture, it means you have understood and you have learned something out of this lecture. If you can't do that, then you have to go through it again and again and again until you achieve the learning objectives or the learning outcomes. Now, when we talk about translation and interpretation, as if we are talking about really writing and speech, or as if we are talking about written language or speech. Why? Because translation really has something to do with the written language, with writing. Interpretation has something to do with speech, because speech historically preceded written language. I mean, we speak before we write, don't we? In the following slides, I will differentiate between interpretation and interpreting. Like translation and translating, really. Translation is the product, translating is the process, and interpretation is the product of the interpreting. Interpreting is the process, but we'll come to this later. So interpretation or interpreting was used before translation as a means of communication between people of different languages, of course. But still, translation was the main stream. Interpretation or interpreting branched out from translation. So this is a very, very brief introduction to this topic. Translation versus interpretation or interpreting. Now, before we go to talk about interpretation or interpreting, I'd like to make sure that you understand the following domains of translation. Translation has certain domains. Domains, what do we mean by domains? Domains means the subject matter and the province. It means the field of the material you want to translate. Now, how many domains do we have? We have literary domain, which involves the translation of prose and poetry. Literary, like novel, drama, essays, and poetry. We have technical and medical domains. Involves all sorts of scientific texts. Scientific texts or technical texts like manuals, maintenance, medical, like medical books, and so on and so forth. We have legal domain. Legal domain means any text that has something to do with legal documents, legal scripts, law in general. And then we have political and diplomatic domain, which involves the translation of text relating to diplomacy and politics, like the domain of the newspapers. Most of it is politically or diplomatically oriented texts. In addition to these, we have social and cultural domains. And this has something to do with text relating to customs, traditions, habits of a particular community, of a particular society, of a particular language. And then we have the economic domain, which involves the translation of text relating to economics, finance, and commerce. Then we have something called general domain. A general domain involves the translation of all sorts of text, which have nothing to do with the above categories. Cooking, I don't know. So I leave it to you. Any text which does not belong to the categories I have mentioned here, then you can say general domain. Now, when you translate, inshallah, if you want to become a translator, you can't translate like this, empty-handed. You need some help. You need some tools. You need some aids so that you can do your job properly. Now, there are different types of aids: linguistic aids, literature aids, and mechanical aids. So you need to make sure that you have got all these tools and aids next to you, or equipped with them. Now, what do we mean by linguistic aids? We mean the use of monolingual dictionaries, such as Collins Dictionary, or even Arabic Dictionary, Al-Muhit, Al-Munjid, and bilingual dictionaries such as Al-Mawrid, and glossaries, which differs, of course, from dictionaries, because they contain a selection of words in a language given within a very, very restricted field only, can be helpful to you. So the linguistic aids could be monolingual dictionaries, like Collins Dictionary, or like Al-Muhit in Arabic. Sometimes really, you need to find out, or you need to be sure about the exact meaning of a certain Arabic word. Some people might smile now, say, Arabic, yes, because you don't, I mean, it happened with me. I had to check a certain word in Al-Muhit or in Al-Munjid to make sure that I understand this Arabic word correctly. So you have Al-Muhit Dictionary, you have Collins Dictionary. They are monolingual. It means one language. And you have bilingual dictionaries. So many. There are so many dictionaries. The scientific, the technical and scientific dictionary, Ahmad Shafiq, and then you've got Al-Mawrid, Arabic English, or English Arabic, sorry, English Arabic, and then you've got Hansfer, from Arabic into English, or Arabic English. It's a beautiful dictionary. So this is what I mean by linguistic aids. Now the literature aids, this type of aid is really necessary in certain cases. You need, this involves books or translated text and technical encyclopedia, for instance, which have something in common with the subject matter you are translating. So you need to have references where you can check, you know, if you need. Have you understood this text properly? Can I benefit from this book, because this book is about the same subject matter I'm translating. Now, the third aid is mechanical aids. Well, now we have got the computer. We have, you know, word processor, photocopying machine, typewriters, laptops, computer. All these aids help you to perform your job as the translator very well. Okay, perfectly well. Now, we'll come to interpretation stroke interpreting. Now, as I said earlier, interpretation or interpreting is a very old activity. Very old activity. In the early days of translation, interpreting took the form of oral translation, which is really the definition of interpretation. Now again, I repeat, interpretation is the product of the interpreting process. Interpreting is the process itself, the activity. Like translation, interpretation, translating, interpreting. You are doing it here. Now, in other words, interpreting is the oral translation of a message in one language into an equivalent oral message in another language. Really, the difference is just, it is oral, it is verbal. This is the only difference between translation and interpreting, to be honest. I mean, the main difference, but we'll see later the difference between the two. Now, somebody called Arjuna defines interpretation as the oral translation of a message across a cultural and linguistic barrier. Again, oral translation of a message across a cultural and linguistic barrier. Translation involves written language, interpreting involves oral language or verbal language. Okay? Now, I'm sure some of you must have heard of conference interpreting. Conference interpreting, like a baby, was started during World War I or during World War I. And the language which was used during that time was French. So during that period, there were some VIP American and British negotiators. So they couldn't understand French, so they had to interpret for them. And since then, interpreting has been used in conference meetings. But internationally known as conference interpreting. Conference interpreting. The most popular and the most important type of interpreting. Of course, now some other forms of interpreting have developed and have been used by so many organizations, so many people, most of the world. Now we have something called business interpreting. We have something called court interpreting, community interpreting, sign language interpreting. Business interpreting, like when you are holding a business meeting with, for instance, Chinese team and the Saudi team, or British team or American team with the Saudi team. You need an interpreter in business. You know, so this is business. Court interpreting, when we have, for instance, in Britain, we have a criminal who doesn't speak English, and at the court, and the police would like to know what he's saying. So they need to have an interpreter. They bring the interpreter to the court. And I once acted as an interpreter. So the judge was asking questions to the accused, I wouldn't say criminal, to the accused, and the accused would say something in Arabic or in French, and I would translate it into English. And the judge would say something in English, I would translate it, or I would interpret it verbally to the accused. All right? So this is what we call court interpreting. Now regarding community interpreting, what happens that in a country like Britain, we have different communities, you know, like the Polish community, the Arab community, the Pakistani community, the Chinese community. These are communities, and sometimes problems happens, like in any other country, and when, for instance, a Polish gets in trouble, the police gets in to solve the problem, then the police would like to have an interpreter. So they take the accused with an interpreter to the police station, and then they sort out all the details about the crime or about the whatever you call it. So an interpreter here is called a community interpreter. Sign language interpreting, I'm sure you see it, for instance, on the Saudi channels and the Jazeera channels. You know, give it sign, use sign language interpreting. They interpret the signs. Now, having said that, we come to a very important part. You need to understand. You need to really know the definition of a conference interpreter, because it's not that simple. It's not that easy. It's not that easy. Now, before you become an interpreter, you need to know what we mean by an interpreter. So, to give you officially, a seminar on interpreters and interpreting was held by the European Forum at Alpbach, Austria, in 1969. They agreed, the people who met there agreed on the following definition of a conference interpreter. Now what it says, a conference interpreter is one whose office it is to translate, whose office means whose job, it is to translate orally the speech of participants in meetings conducted in 2 or more languages. His office means his job may be performed simultaneously or consecutively in the participants' presence. So the participants should be present, and you are interpreting. This is the official definition of interpreter. Now, the types and modes of interpreting. This is quite important, quite important. Now, we have 3 types of interpreting. simultaneous interpretation or interpreting, consecutive interpretation or interpreting, and whispered interpretation or whispered interpreting. Now let's take simultaneous interpretation or simultaneous interpreting. Now in this kind of interpreting, now the interpreter listens to what is being said and then translate it orally and simultaneously into the target language. Simultaneously, it means right away. Right away he translated verbally, orally. Right away, he doesn't wait. Just you say, hello, marhab. Assalamu alaikum, peace, may peace be upon you. Right away. This is what we mean by simultaneous. Now, the second type of interpreting is consecutive interpretation or interpreting. Now, in this kind, what the interpreter does, especially in meetings, you know, in meetings, the interpreter sits in the conference room and takes what is being said at the said, and then takes notes. At the end of the meeting, he gives an oral statement. In a very, I think he would just listen, take notes, summarizes it in a statement. You are at a meeting, and they said to you, look, we'd like you to listen to us and translate what is being said. You say, all right. You consecutively, you take notes, and then at the end of the meeting or at the end of what is said, you translate it verbally. You give a statement, you give a summary. Now, this is a consecutive interpretation. Now, whispered, this happens, the interpreters sit between two delegates. But this happens between really very, very high level, like two presidents. He whispers into their ears the oral translation of what is being said. Whispered interpreting tends to be done really between presidents, between prime ministers, between really like a patient. Well, it could happen at the hospital as well. Now, a patient and an interpreter and a doctor. Now, the doctor, because he doesn't want to shout at the patient, does he? Now, he whispers into the interpreter's ear, and the interpreter whispers into the patient's ear. So it happens, not necessarily with presidents or prime ministers, but it happens when the situation requires that. Okay? Now, last but not least, this list or this comparison summarizes the differences between a translation and interpreting. Now you can look at the left side here, left side, this one, this side, and this side. This is translation, this is interpreting. Now translation involves only written text. Interpreting involves spoken texts. Regarding time is not really very important regarding translation because you can take your time. Whereas in interpreting, time is crucial. You have to finish it, on time. You can't take more than what is needed or what is required. Now, the third, regarding translation, there is a permanent record of what is being done. It means you put it down. There is a record left. Whereas, generally, not necessarily, generally speaking, In interpreting, there is no record of what is being said. Somebody might say, well, we can record it. It's fine, you can record it, but I'm saying in general, when you are interpreting, generally there is no written record, or there is no record of what is being said. Now, the focus regarding number 4, the focus in translation is normally on the linguistic unit, the linguistic units of the text. Whereas the focus in the interpretation is generally on ideas. In interpretation or interpreting, I want to listen to your ideas so that I can transfer ideas. Whereas in translation, I have to look at the linguistic units. In other words, the words, the vocabulary, grammar, structure, connectors, discourse, and all these items I have to look at. Cultural aspects, sociocultural factors in the text, so many factors. We have to look in the text. Now, number 5, in translation, it involves formal memory. Like, you need to have formal record of numbers, days, where it should be really, really accurate and precise. So in translation, you need to be accurate and precise regarding dates and numbers and so on. Whereas in interpreting, it has to do with the semantic memory. I mean, what you need to remember is meaning, you know. You need to transfer the meaning to the person waiting for the interpretation. So meaning is the most important element in the message, as far as interpreting is concerned. So these are very important differences between the translation and interpreting. I hope you have an idea now about translation and interpretation, or translation and interpreting, and the difference between the translation and interpreting. And I wish you all the best, and thank you very much indeed.